Hello everyone, I am Anthropomantic Fiend, and I do horror-related things on the internet. This isn't exactly horror-related, but as I went over in my favorite songs of 2019 video that I made a year ago, my taste in music, like my taste in just about everything else, does tend to veer towards the macabre, the dark, and the heavy, so I'm making this a part of my Rotten Recommendations series anyhow. I've talked about a lot of my favorite music at length in my favorite songs videos, but I am going to just run through really quick what some of my favorite albums of this past year were, and hopefully you'll find something cool to listen to that way. If you do like the sound of anything I mention, I am going to try and link all of the bands I talk about below. Without further ado, here are my favorite albums of 2020. Amaranth with Manifest. Amaranth are a Swedish metal band. They mix punchy melodic metal with a few different styles. They have three singers. They have Elise, who sings in sort of a pop style, Nils, who has more of a power metal voice, and Henrik, who growls. That sort of mixture of pop rock, power metal, and almost like melodic death metal is really what gives Amaranth their signature sound. They tend to have a really distinct kind of just punchy melodic synth-heavy sound, but they're at the same time incredibly varied because you have songs like Crystalline that is this heartfelt, mellow ballad, and then a song like Boom, which is basically Henrik growl rapping through this really aggressive song, and it's amazing and kind of hilarious at the same time. So if you want a bunch of crazy melodic metal earworms, Amaranth are absolutely the way to go. The Birthday Massacre with Diamonds. The Birthday Massacre usually get categorized as dark wave, but they are really their own thing. They are an, I guess, alternative rock band. They have guitars that range from very heavy to kind of this jangly 80s Cure type sound with very heavy influences from 80s synth pop as well as 80s synth soundtracks, synthesized, if you will, into their own just really distinct sound that is very dark and macabre, but also playful, fun, and fantasy oriented. Hence the combination of Birthday and Massacre, and their whole purple aesthetic throughout their albums, because red and blue kind of symbolizes the meeting of those two elements for them as well. This is not the Birthday Massacre's heaviest album, but the more I listen to it, the more I love it. You have just really, really catchy songs on here, like Enter, The Sky Will Turn, and literally everything on here. It's another earwormy album. The more I listen to it, the more I love it. As far as Birthday Massacre albums go, this is probably one of their dreamiest sounding, and it's great to just get lost in the lush synth atmosphere that they create on this album. Delane with Apocalypse and Chill. Delane are, I believe, a Dutch symphonic metal band. They started, from what I can tell, with a very traditional symphonic metal sound, but they have really evolved into their own thing. The title of this album is oddly fitting for 2020, which is weird, because despite coming out in 2020, it came out before the pandemic was a thing, so wow. This album brings in, much like some of the past things I talked about, this very 80s synth influence. As a matter of fact, I think they are influenced by the Birthday Massacre to some extent, while also retaining this lush symphonic movie score sounding backing to a lot of the tracks, as well as just this really heavy, beefy guitar tone. This also features Janus from Beast in Black on one of the tracks, so we get that more power metal edge on one of the songs. You have an instrumental on here called Combustion, which is just insane. It veers into something between metalcore and Dream Theater, is the best way to describe it. And you have orchestral versions of some of the tracks on here, so you can just listen to the orchestration, which is really nice as well. Charlotte, the vocalist and songwriter for Delane, is probably one of my favorite lyricists in symphonic metal. She is not writing in the realms of like epic fantasy as much as I love that stuff. It's very grounded in reality and emotion, and it has this kind of very modern, snarky sensibility to it in some places, which is fun, but also genuinely heartfelt and wonderful. So if you want a really unique sounding symphonic metal band and a really unique sounding symphonic metal album that is very much of its time in more ways than one, Apocalypse and Chill by Delane, I highly recommend. Fool Me Once by Fable Cry. Fable Cry are a band that describe themselves as theatrical scamp rock. They have evolved from like a tiny two-piece band into this wonderful, huge lineup with guitar and multiple vocalists and a bassist and a drummer and keys and violin and this huge, very theatrical sound. Their aesthetic is very Burton-esque in look and very Danny Elfman-esque in sound, but a bit earthier than that, if it makes sense. They've definitely always had influences from people like Tom Waits. This album is a concept album that is set in the 1930s and talks about these two people kind of in the criminal underground who have been killed off by this criminal mastermind, Harold the Diamond Hellsinger, and then they come back as vampires to plot their revenge. I feel like you could do this album as a stage play because the songs really do feel like musical numbers from a stage musical that was never made, interspersed with little snippets of radio broadcasts with breaking news to fill in the gaps, as well as narration from our main kind of detective character. I forget his name, but he's just trying to piece the whole thing together, and we get to hear him trying to piece together the mystery himself, which is really, really fun. All the music on here is very dark and theatrical, and it's this really interesting mixture of 30s jazz and dancehall sounding music with hard rock and this spooky Elfman-esque edge that is really, really fun to listen to, and everyone is just a phenomenal musician in this band as well. Worlds Away by Lindsay Schoolcraft. I probably just do not even shut up about Lindsay on my channel at this point because she's awesome and I keep buying her music and listening to it. I discovered her because she was the former keyboardist in Cradle of Filth, who are one of my favorite bands, but she has moved on to doing her solo project as well as her black metal project Antiqua full-time. All of that is fantastic as well. And this album is kind of a 10th anniversary deal. What it is a few new tracks and a bunch of older Lindsay tracks that have been reworked as ethereal harp arrangements. Her first album is just Schoolcraft, was more just a gothic symphonic alternative thing with no real metal element. Martyr was this evanescence pushing into even heavier gothic metal type album, and this is stuff from both of those eras and everything in between turned into just beautiful ethereal harp tracks. So if you want something relaxing and soothing and ethereal and beautiful while also being very melancholy and dark and thought-provoking, I highly recommend all of Lindsay's music, but this album in particular. And the art is also just beautiful. Pyre of the Black Heart by Marco Hietala. I kind of talked about this album in my favorite songs of 2019 video, but that was because that was only the Finnish version of the album that had been released at the time, and this year an entirely English language version of the album came out. Marco has been in a lot of bands. He's been in the heavy metal band Tarot, he's been in Northern Kings, Synergy, a million other projects, but he's probably best known for being the bassist from Nightwish, and very recently he did decide to step away from Nightwish, both because of mental health stuff and issues with the music industry. And while I'm really saddened by that, I completely respect it as well. He really just need to take care of himself and do what's best for him. So I will miss you, Marco, but I wish you the absolute best in life. As I mentioned probably the last time I talked about this album, it's not exactly metal, but It's described by Marco as being kind of hard prog, which I would agree with. It has elements of metal, but also elements of hard rock and folk and just really fun, funky influences throughout. And it's very melancholic and brooding without being dissonant or completely downbeat. The album is very playful while still having heartfelt, dark lyrics, which I appreciated. And Marco's voice is just amazing. As I think I've mentioned, his style of singing reminds me of classic metal and power metal vocalists like Ronnie James Dio and Bruce Dickinson from Iron Maiden, but his vocal tone and delivery and dynamic is really unique to him at the same time, which I think is wonderful. And that especially shows on this album, which is far from straightforward metal. It's very much his own unique little melancholic but fun hard rock thing. So if that sounds like anything you would like, I highly, highly recommend checking this out, and check out the Finnish language version too. It's fun to compare. And speaking of Marco and of Nightwish, we have the new album from Nightwish, Human Nature. Nightwish are probably my favorite bands. They are a symphonic metal band from Finland, but they are a lot more than that as well. They combine big Howard Shore, Hans Zimmer style orchestrations with beefy Metallica style riffs, but also European folk influences and progressive rock and elements of other styles of metal like power metal, and occasionally something kind of growly and dark and dissonant. So many different wonderful influences within Nightwish's music, and this album is no exception. I'm really into the way they decided to do this particular album, which was to have the first disc of the album represent the human, which was 9 more or less metal tracks with no full orchestration behind them, just Tuomas's keyboards and choir, and then utilizing vocal harmonies from all 3 singers, Floor, Troy, and Marco, on all of the songs, with Floor doing most of the lead singing, but Marco and Troy having their time to shine as well. And the second disc being the nature aspect, with a big orchestral piece called All the Works of Nature Which Adorn the World, which is beautiful, beautiful orchestration with bits of narration throughout, as well as some vocal lines from Floor, which is wonderful and lovely. I have reviewed this album in full on the channel as well, so if you want deeper thoughts on that, check that out. But I will never not love Nightwish unless they turn out to be actual horrible people at some point, which I doubt will happen. I really hope not. As far as I can tell, they're all just lovely. This is some of Nightwish's best songwriting to date. Doesn't have the nostalgia factor of some of their other stuff for me, but I love it more and more every time I listen to it. And if you like Nightwish, if you like symphonic metal, if you like good music, just check this out. It's really good. If you weren't sensing a pattern by this point, maybe you are now, because my final pick for favorite albums of 2020 is Emerald Seas by Seven Spires, and Seven Spires are another symphonic melodic metal band. They're from the US. Their sound is interesting because it's obviously very symphonic, but it really does vary from Camelot style power metal sounding to something that sounds like symphonic black metal like Cradle of Filth or Dimmu Borgir, which I absolutely love. This album is another concept album. It's a high seas adventure story about the quest for eternal life, as far as I can tell. So you have that kind of seafaring Pirates of the Caribbean swagger to a lot of the songs in here, which is cool. My favorite track off here, if you can only check out one, is Drowner of Worlds, which is one of the darkest tracks on the album. It's kind of talking about mental and emotional turmoil while also talking about a freaking sea monster, and it's doing it with this sinister, malicious symphonic black metal style to it. The vocals on there sound, I don't know, reptilian almost. They have that kind of Danny Filth viciousness to them, which I love. If you love symphonic metal, if you love power metal, if you like symphonic black metal, and if you like high seas adventure, I highly recommend this album, and just anything from Seven Spires, really. I haven't heard anything from them that I dislike. Those are my favorite albums of 2020. There's so much music out there, so I'm sure there's great stuff that I've missed. So feel free to recommend me anything that you listened to in 2020 that you think I should check out. Again, I'm going to try and link all of those bands below, so if you want to check out any of them, their YouTube channels will be down there. And once again, thank you for watching my video, and hopefully I will see you in another one. Bye!